And welcome to the RISE Coastal Community Resilience Challenge session on design thinking and solutioning. I am from Old Dominion University, the Institute for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, and we're working with RISE to help instruct, coach, and put on this challenge for innovative solutions around how do you deal with the problems of coastal communities when you have things like flooding or disasters, or just resilient cities and disconnected communities. So it's a pretty good opportunity for those of you out there with ideas. And to sweeten the pot quite a bit, RISE has over $1 million right now that it's looking to apply towards these particular challenges. So just a couple of housekeeping things. You have to get your initial submissions in for the challenge in by 30th of September. You can find the information on how to do that on the site, which is riseresilience.org. Pretty easy application process. Once you get your information in, there'll be a down select in October, and then there will be teams will be asked to come and present their solutions and possibly tap into that over $1 million worth of funding, which will be used to demonstrate your solutions in Hampton Roads, Virginia, and hopefully produce something that will be of value not only to this region in Virginia, but also value to the world. So today's topic, design thinking and solutioning. We'll talk about what those are and what the differences are, and how they can be helpful to you in really crafting a good solution and a winning submission for the competition. Next slide, please. Okay, design thinking. It's been around for a while. I've been using it for decades. There's a lot of different methodologies on how you might go about it or not go about it. But honestly, the important thing is to have a methodology and really attack in design thinking. The chief thing is identifying the problem you're trying to solve and then what your solution is for that particular problem. And it addresses the issue of a lot of times folks, particularly technologists, and I can say that because I am one, you tend to have your solution already cooked up, and then you try to find problems to apply it to. Design thinking is a little bit different. It asks you to go out and really concentrating on finding out what the problems are before coming up with your end solution. Next slide, please. It all starts with empathy. And the idea of empathy, as you see on the screen here, is to immerse yourself into a situation to gain an understanding. I like to say down to your bones of what's going on in this particular situation, what the people are experiencing, what the communities are experiencing, what's important, all those types of questions. So then you can determine, hey, what are the issues here? And the two images I put on this slide to bring home a point is, you see two pictures of flooding here. And if you live in a city or if you live in a rural area, I don't know where everybody is right now, but yourself, think of how flooding's affected you and what the issues are. So on the left-hand side, if I'm in an urban area, and Norfolk, Virginia is an urban area, we get flooding and interesting things happen. It's a real pain. A lot of the streets have water in them. You can't drive your cars through. Or if you drive your cars through and it's a little bit deeper than you expected, you can kill your engine. Sometimes people get stuck in front of you because they get afraid and they try to back out, or they go cutting across yards. It's not so great. Sometimes we have underpasses, and cars will try to go under the underpass, not realizing that there's 6 feet of water in there. And every time we have a major storm or flooding event, we get pictures on the front page of the paper showing cars floating underneath the underpasses. It's a pain. Every time it rains, you're going, oh gosh, what roads are going to be available or not, those types of things. Having that understanding would be empathy. If you were discussing this with me, you'd want to find out how I feel, how it impacts me, what I think's happening, what my pain points are, those types of things. Now, if you look on the right-hand side of the screen, we've got a picture of flooding again, but we've got a bunch of animals there. So if you've ever lived in a rural area, depending on where you are in the world even, this could be good, this could be bad. Did a session last night, and one of the folks in the session said they grew up in a rural area. When they'd have flooding, they'd lose cows every once in a while. Other places, on the other hand, flooding's part of the natural cycle that they need. Those historians of you out there know the stories of Egypt. Egypt lived on the flooding of the Nile every year. If the Nile didn't flood, people were going to starve and there was going to be famine because there was no silt refilling the valleys. So if you went to the ancient Egyptians and said, hey, I got a really great idea to stop flooding, they'd look at you like you were crazy because flooding was a good thing. In a situation, going and talking to people so you gain that level of understanding of what's important, what's not, what's really an issue, is what empathy is all about. Next slide, please. In empathy, you've gone broad. You try to bring in on all the information you can. If in English you call it gestalt, you're trying to go in and just immerse yourself in the situation. So you open your lens really, really wide, the iris on your lens, the aperture. All right? The next step in this process is to define the problems. And this is where you're trying to throttle down and narrow down the situation so you can say, what is the actual problem or problem set here? And what I found over doing this a bunch of years is when I get into a situation, I'm working the empathy, I'm working to gain that understanding, all of a sudden patterns start to form. And there's really an aha moment where I go, or the team I'm working with goes, hey, we think this is the problem. If this one issue was dealt with, all these other things kind of fall into line and go away or reduce their impact on a situation. So identifying or defining the problem is that aha moment. And you see the little kind of, I guess they look like Christmas balls or kind of that Newtonian thing that goes back and forth. But the classic questions: what, who, where, when, why, how, okay? What's going on, okay? What's happening? Who's it happening to? Who's getting impacted by this whole thing? Where does it occur? Is it everywhere? Or is it only certain particular, in the case of flooding, intersections? Or is it only certain areas? Okay. When does it occur? Is this a one-time thing? Is this a once every 100 or 500 year thing? Or is it like, thinking about flooding, the streets of Venice, kind of acqua alta. You get a high tide, and all of a sudden folks are, putting wooden sidewalks out so they can walk over. It happens every time there's a tide. So when does it happen? Ask questions on how it happens. What's the mechanism? This overflows and this gets flooded, or somebody goes and tries to do this and the other thing happens. Working with the team the other day, talking about neighborhoods, they went out and we're doing discovery and interviewing people about, the issues, and they thought the issue was, getting cars through water. And they were talking to some folks in the neighborhood, and the folks go, we don't use cars. Not an issue to them. And then the thing about why does it happen? Trying to get a sense from your talking with people, why does this occur? Okay, so that's defining the problem. And you're trying to get one or two well-defined problems, and you're also trying to define what success is. So this problem wouldn't exist if this happened, or if I didn't have this problem, I would be able to do another thing, the thing I want to do. So that's the definition of problem mode. Next slide, please. Now we're going to go broad again. And this is the ideate or ideation phase of the design thinking methodology. The idea here now is that I present you with a problem and you say, or your team says, what are all the ways I could solve this problem? And you see some things we have listed on the slide, things called thought experiments. What if we could fill in the blank? So somebody brought up an example of in Norfolk, Virginia, they're going to start requiring building owners potentially to capture a certain percentage of the rainwater that falls upon their buildings. Okay, well, if it's just preventing rain from falling on your buildings, what if we can put a giant fan there? What if we could make a big sponge and stick it in an upper room in the building and the sponge could absorb it? And then all the other normal things that folks might think of. But going broad on your ideas and playing those thought experiments is really, really useful. And the other thing is throwing in crazy ideas. You're not trying to stop anybody at this point or filter what they're saying or discourage brainstorming. You're looking for a whole broad set of solutions because crazy just might be a really good thing. And a fantastic example of this is kind of in the common e-commerce and apps right now. At some point in time, somebody came up with the crazy idea of, hey, let's give it away for free. That really wasn't done a lot in the past. Let's allow people to list their houses for free, for example. Used to be you had to pay a newspaper to put something in a classified ad, and you paid them per every week it ran. In some of the newer models on apps, I allow people to put their houses in the app for free. And then the people who buy them, can look at it for free. And maybe I take something just because I'm a really powerful platform and I'm selling advertising space to another person. But the two major players in that, from a frontline impact, the buyer and the seller, they're able to get their things at no fee because it's all being covered by the advertisers. That was a crazy idea when it first started, and now that's sort of the model by which a bunch of the apps these days work. So the idea with ideation is go broad. Crazy's okay. In fact, you might even take a time and you say, let's all throw out the craziest things we can think of. Next slide, please. As you get towards the end of ideation, the same thing happens to you that happens towards the end of the empathy phase. All of a sudden, patterns start to appear. Aha moments occur. And you start saying, gosh, we can think of 2 or 3 of those ideas that really seem to solve the issues, really seem to solve the problems. So you kind of scrape away the other ones because you can't do everything at once, and you do what they call prototyping. The idea of prototyping is you pick the most promising solutions, and then what you're going to do is you're going to build representations of those solutions. And so it doesn't need to be, if you were thinking of a new car, you don't need to build a full-scale mock-up of that car, for example. But what you have to do is you have to define something well enough that the people you're going to talk to about it can envision the solution occurring. So that can happen with, maybe 3D printing of certain things, maybe building cardboard mock-ups of something. It could even be as simple as doing some whiteboard work and having a diagram there where you can walk somebody through the process of how this new order or this solution is going to work. The key thing is as long as folks can envision what you're talking about, your prototype's probably pretty good. Some folks use things like analogy. Okay, if I'm now going to make an app that enables people who want to obtain goats for eating the grass on their lawn so they don't have to mow, to rent goats. Okay, that's kind of a weird thing, but if I say to somebody, oh, it's kind of like Uber for goats or Airbnb for goats, all of a sudden somebody who's familiar with Uber or Airbnb might say, oh, I get it. Somebody lists something that's available. I want it. I agree to get it for a little while, and Uber or whomever is just going to take the payment and take a little bit of slice off of it. The only thing to be careful about with analogies is when you're going to talk to people, if they don't get the analogy, then that analogy is not going to work there. You're going to have to find another one or find another way to represent your particular solution so you can talk to people. Next slide. Testing. This is the tail end of the design thinking process, but it could also be the point at which you loop back to the beginning again. In testing, you take those prototypes that you've put together, those representations of what your solution is, that you can describe it and people can understand what you're talking about. And you circle back to some of those people you were doing discovery and empathizing with. And you're checking with them, hey, here's what we think a solution would be. It does X, Y, and Z at these points in time. This is your involvement with it. What do you think? You think this would solve your problem? Is it worthwhile? Would you pay for it? Those sort of things. And at that point, you want to test all your prototypes. So it's just not, okay, they like the first one, so I don't have to go any further. Check all your prototypes out with people And then be prepared to get feedback. Because what I find is, I'll go and I'll sink myself into a situation, I'll immerse myself into a situation. I think I understand it. I come up with some solutions for it. I go back to the folks I was talking to who are impacted by that particular problem, and they go, okay, I like your X, Y, and Z portion here, but the W is really not going to work, and here's why. I learn from that, and I go back and I iterate. So I've learned something. I redefine the problem a little bit based upon what I learned. I think of how I need to, how I might change my solution to match that, prototype again, and test. And keep iterating that until finally I've got a solution that folks are going, hey, yeah, that could really, really work. And then you're off this process and you're into another one. Next slide. So I like to say, kind of like Isaac Newton, we all stand on the shoulders of giants. One of the giants in this area is the Stanford Design School. And this particular version of design thinking, this particular definition of the phases, really comes from them and from a company called IDEO, who I've liked ever since they came into existence. They do really, really good work. But again, the flow of this is, first thing you want to do is empathize. And empathizing is not about the solution. You're not going in there and saying, let me test my solution on you. You're going in there to really understand how people are being impacted by this particular area you think's a problem. You move into the definition phase as you start to see patterns and aha moments, and you're able to define what the problem is and what the solution, not the solution, but what the results of solving that problem would be. Because sometimes, the problem just might be a symptom. And if folks can get to, what they wanted to do all along, then you can totally change your solution. That sort of thing. An example I've heard discussed was, elevators go too slow. All right, and so people are coming up with ideas of faster motors, hydraulic lifts, pneumatic tubes, all that other kind of bit. And then really what somebody figured out was, the problem is people are just bored on elevators, have nothing to do, and, it makes the time go long. So one of the things they started doing was installing mirrors on elevators. People like to look at themselves. Now all of a sudden, the elevator hasn't sped up. It's just people are kind of fixing their tie, they're fixing their hair, that sort of thing. It takes up the time. It makes the time go by faster. Those are two different ways of looking at the problem. One is, oh my gosh, I got to speed up the elevator. Or really the root problem is people are bored with nothing to do on an elevator, so it seems like they're wasting time. Put in the mirror. They're not wasting time anymore. You move from the definition to the ideation phase, which we talked about. You want to go broad. You want to brainstorm. A lot of good techniques for doing this you can find on the web. Prototypes are representational, and then test, test, test. Next slide. And we talked about this before. In empathy, you diverge really, really wide. In definition, you're kind of converging and you're narrowing down. When you get to brainstorming solutions, you're spreading out apart again. For prototyping, you're shrinking down the solutions, and then you're into the test phase. Next slide. Some key tenets, some kind of recommendations, words of advice, that type of thing. I like to tell people to start with the beginner's mind. So if you're going into an area and you're trying to gestalt or immerse yourself in, try to limit your assumptions going in. I mean, obviously you're going in with a particular idea in mind. You're just not blindly walking into a neighborhood and just saying, hey, what do you got going? With no particular domain or problem set in your mind. But you are going in without saying, I'm assuming that everybody cares about this issue. That might not be the case. So a beginner's mind saying, be prepared to learn. Next thing, find the patterns. All this stuff is about patterns. And those are those aha moments when you say, hey, this is starting to make sense. There's a flow that goes here, which either defines a problem or defines a solution. Next one, we talked about it earlier. Define the problem, and particularly what's success. What's trying to be achieved? If I eliminated that problem, what would I be able to do? Because sometimes a solution that gets somebody to what they want to be able to do and takes the problem out of play works too, kind of like the elevator. When you brainstorm, do it without judgment. So if you're in a room full of people, it's a free-for-all. Get the stuff out there and let the patterns form. Even a crazy idea might end up being one that makes the world a better place or makes your business really, really work. Don't fall in love with your prototypes. I can tell you I've made that mistake before. Look for the feedback. Feedback is the breakfast of champions. I'll show somebody something and I'm really looking for how to make it better or even find out if the darn thing's going to work to begin with. And again, look for the aha moments. It's about aha moments and patterns. Next slides. So where to apply design thinking? Design thinking is really not for standard problems that have already been solved. I want to configure a router. That's a solved problem. Most of the time, I want to build a bridge. If I know the soil types and I know the construction material and I know the span, I can look a lot of that up. So those are kind of the standard ones. But design thinking is really, really good for something they call wicked problems. Wicked problems are those intractable. They're not easily solved. There's no guidance in things that exist necessarily on how to do it, or if guidance exists, it's really not all that good and doesn't solve the problems, and people are still frustrated. If I was going to classify the types of problems that the RISE Coastal Resiliency Challenge is going against, things like coastal flooding, disconnected communities, workforce development, adaptive buildings and those sorts of things, those are wicked problems. So design thinking really, really could work well here. Next slide. Now we'll talk about solutioning. Once I've settled upon what I think is going to be a solution, I haven't defined all the details for that solution. So it's really pretty high level at this point in time. Solutioning is now about taking your ideas to implementation. And to me, the key word in solutioning is completeness. You've thought of the angles, you've thought of what's going to happen to the thing, and you're able to make it so it's a success. So if you go to the next slide, here's a way to look at solutioning. A lot of different models around it, but if I was going to simplify it, solutioning comes down to something which is a solution is not a technology. I can hand you a technology, but if you don't know what to do with it, that technology doesn't solve a problem. I can hand you a technology, but if the organization doesn't incorporate how that technology can provide value to them into its standard operating procedures or its business procedures, that technology doesn't provide value. So a true solution incorporates processes. What are the processes by which things happen? Technologies. What are the technologies that support those processes? What's the people involvement in those processes? And a good point to bring up here is a lot of times technologists will think, okay, we'll concentrate on the technology and the people part will just happen. Having done kind of postmortems on all sorts of things that didn't work, most of the time it's not the technology that failed. Most of the time is they weren't paying attention to the people component. And after a couple of transfer cycles or retirements and rehires or growth, nobody remembered how to use the darn technology anymore. And what they did was they started using the technology to do things in the old way. So there was no organizational change, there was no implementation. So you got to think about the people part. Okay? So you put all those things together in a way that they're designed to achieve an outcome, a societal outcome, a mission outcome, a business outcome, whatever. Okay? And you have to consider it over the life cycle of that solution interacting with the organization of the problem. So what's the life cycle? Life cycle is, how are you going to implement this? Okay, I've got a great new piece of software I'm going to provide to a municipality. I just don't hand them the box. There has to be some guidance on, okay, does the software require access to data sets? How are those going to get in there? Where do those data sets come from? Okay, the organization already has all its standard operating procedures for, say, emergency response into place. All right, how does my solution change those processes? They need to be gone through, and either the solution needs to be configured to go with the organization's processes, or the organization's processes have to be redone to enable the technology, or some mix of the two. But the old saying is nothing works right out of the box. You got to implement it. Then sustainment. Once you got it in place, how are you going to operate this thing? How are you going to maintain it? Okay, what do people do day in, day out with it? All right, so how does it operate? And then how does it improve? Most things improve over time. So what's the change management aspect of this? If I change a bit of the technology, how do I get that back out to the organization? How do I make sure that people get retrained on maybe if the people's behavior needs to change because of this change in the process, or this change in the technology? You have to think about improvement. And the last is end of life. Some things there are components of that you have to do something when you shut them down. So if you think of oil spills, booms that absorb oil. Okay, great. I implement by deciding where they need to be, and I keep them in warehouses near where spills might be. I operate by when a spill happens and I put the oil boom out. But once that oil boom's soaked, what happens with it? In the environmental world, you're talking cradle to grave. Okay, what's the grave for that oily boom? How do you get rid of it? Okay, and then in your process, how do you restock so you're ready for the next event? So that's the general overview of solutioning. Next slide. Now I'd like to talk about two ways I've used in the past to help work through solutions. The first is really relying on business process. And I'll go and I'll create business process diagrams for each of those major engagement areas. So what's my process for implementing? Do I need to configure stuff? Do I need to identify data sources? Do I need to train the trainer or get the people on board? Do I need to build a server room or provide new technologies or upload software? So lay out that entire process, then lay out the operational process, lay out the sustainment and those other areas. And then for each one of those blocks, go back through, and within the block, what's the process that occurs in that block? What's the technologies I use along with things like data? And what do the people need to do? And if I follow that discipline, what I'll find is I'll find holes. And I just keep on patching those holes and filling those holes until the solution's rather complete. Another way of doing it, next slide, which I like a lot, is sort of a riff on day in the life. Where I'm writing day in the life of scenarios. So if you think of your solution, probably has people who play roles within that solution. I might have a frontline person. I might have a manager. I might have the person who's going to pay for this whole thing, something along those lines. What I try to write is like a little narrative. I write a story saying, hey, I'm Jerry. How did I find out about this thing? I heard about this really great new app. I went to the App Store. I found it and I downloaded it. Then I found out it needed certain data, so I had to link it up with my contacts, and it didn't do that automatically, but it gave me instructions on how to do it by plugging in a code. And I just walked through the entire process all the way through to the end until I'm finished with the particular solution. And then I might do it for the manager who's using the thing. But if I write those kind of scenarios, and again, for each area of engagement, what I find is I'm thinking of things that need to go into my design. If I'm using software, I log in. Oh, I forgot to put in, any kind of login capability within the thing. Gosh, I'd want to search for opportunities. I need to write search into this thing. So by doing scenarios, you're kind of telling a story, and then you're building the solution to support the story. Next slide. So, recap, design thinking versus solutioning. Design thinking is about discovering the issues and finding solutions for the right problems. So you're not a solution and look in search of a problem or in search of a market. In this case, you're going in there and you're trying to find the issues first, and then you build or you adapt your solution, but you don't go in with your solution. Solutioning is about defining complete solutions. Solutioning is about defining it well enough that you can actually do an implementation and it can provide value to your stakeholders and the people you're working with at first and into the future. Next slide. Page of resources, and we're going to put this on the website, so if you want to download a copy, it'll be there for you. The RISE Resilience office, you can get to them at riseresilience.org. A thing to note is we're offering one-on-one coaching with RISE, and there's also RISE office hours. So go to the site. If you want to arrange for any of that stuff, we'll do some one-on-one work with you to think through some of your issues as you're getting towards the September 30th deadline for submitting your solution. That's my email address. Again, I'm at Old Dominion University's Institute for Innovation and Entrepreneurship. My email address is there. Stanford Design School, a lot of great stuff on their website. Same thing with IDEO, a lot of great stuff on their website. And Tim Brown, who is one of the founders of IDEO, did a really great TED Talk on this stuff. But in general, if you Google design thinking, you can find a lot of stuff out there that's probably going to be a lot of use to you. Thanks for your time, and looking forward to seeing your submissions.